You know that feeling, right? When something just feels deeply unfair. That knot in your stomach.
Oh, absolutely. We've all felt that, I think. It's
Yeah.
that core sense of injustice.
Exactly. And it's more than just a passing feeling, isn't it?
It really is. Today, we're doing a deep dive into, well, the serious emotional weight injustice carries. For individuals, sure, but also for, society as a whole.
Right. We've looked at a bunch of different viewpoints to try and get a handle on it.
Our mission today isn't just looking at single events. We want to unpack the bigger picture, the psychological fallout, the social stuff, how communities are affected.
But without getting totally lost in the weeds, hopefully. So maybe we should start with a definition. What are we actually talking about when we say injustice?
Good starting point. So fundamentally, injustice is about a violation of rights or a lack of fair treatment.
Okay.
And that leads directly to unequal outcomes and, well, suffering. What's really important to grasp is that this isn't like consigned to one area or group. It's a global issue.
Affects everyone, everywhere, in some way.
Precisely. And it's not just about, say, material things. It hits at someone's basic sense of worth, their value.
Mm.
And that's huge for psychological well-being.
Yeah, that makes sense. It attacks who you are. And you said it creates ripples. It doesn't just stop with the person directly affected.
Exactly. Think of it like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples spread out. An act of injustice changes the emotional temperature of the whole society around it.
Like this background hum of unfairness.
Kinda, yeah. An invisible weight, maybe.
So let's talk about individuals then. What does that weight feel like psychologically? What are the first hits?
Well, the immediate reactions are usually pretty potent. Anger, obviously. Resentment towards whoever is seen as responsible. And often this really deep sense of helplessness.
Powerlessness.
That's it. But those are just the surface emotions,
Right. It goes deeper than that. What about the longer-term mental health side?
Oh, definitely. We often see anxiety, depression setting in. And think about self-esteem. If you're constantly treated unfairly, it just eats away at your sense of self-worth.
Yeah, I can see that.
And then there's trauma. Experiencing injustice can be genuinely traumatic.
How does that show up? Physically? Emotionally?
Both, actually.
Mm.
It might manifest physically, maybe as chronic stress symptoms, headaches, stomach issues, that kind of thing. And emotionally, well, it can lead to something called moral injury.
Moral injury? Tell me more about that.
It's the distress you feel when you either do something, fail to prevent something, or even just witness something that goes against your own moral code.
Ah, okay. So even seeing injustice can cause this kind of injury.
Yes, and that trauma, whether direct or witnessed, can really take root. Our sources mentioned PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in connection with this.
Right. I remember seeing that. There was a study mentioned.
Yeah, research, like in the American Journal of Psychiatry, shows higher rates of PTSD symptoms in people who faced significant injustice. The re-experiencing, feeling numb, being constantly on edge.
Hypervigilance.
Exactly. It's a heavy burden. And that feeling we mentioned earlier, helplessness, lacking control, that just makes it all so much worse.
It really connects, doesn't it? Feeling powerless in the face of unfairness would absolutely ramp up anxiety and stress. And I guess some people face this much more often than others.
Absolutely. Marginalized groups often encounter systemic injustice, unfairness, built into the system itself, not just isolated incidents far more frequently.
So they're more vulnerable to these mental health impacts.
Disproportionately so, yes. And another layer here is collective injustice. When your personal distress is part of a wider pattern affecting your whole community, it gets amplified.
Wow.
That can create these really harmful cycles. People might withdraw, feel afraid, disengage from society.
So that shared experience, knowing it's not just me, could actually make the despair worse in some ways.
It can, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. We've talked about the individual toll. How does all this start to damage the social fabric, the community connections?
Yeah, how does it break things down?
Well, when people constantly see or experience unfairness, they start feeling vulnerable, disenfranchised. That basic trust you need in a community, it starts to crack.
You stop trusting institutions, maybe even neighbors.
Exactly. You see bonds fracturing, suspicion growing. People feel more isolated, alienated from society.
So it gets harder to feel like you belong, like you're part of something bigger.
Precisely. That sense of community cohesion weakens. People might start looking out only for themselves. Self-preservation kicks in over collective well-being.
And does that affect community life, like events, getting involved?
Yeah, you often see a drop in participation. Communal activities, civic engagement, people pull back. The shared identity of the community kind of fades.
And you mentioned witnesses earlier experiencing moral injury. Does witnessing injustice also contribute to this breakdown?
It does. That moral distress we talked about. Even if you are the target, seeing unfairness can make you feel uneasy, disconnected, like the community doesn't reflect your values.
Which feeds back into that lack of trust.
Exactly. It becomes a cycle. Mistrust breeds conditions where more injustice can happen, which leads to more helplessness, more despair. It's really insidious.
Gosh, yeah. A vicious cycle. And this weaker social fabric, does it have knock-on effects for other things in society?
Oh, definitely. If you look at the bigger picture, communities with weaker social ties often face bigger challenges with, say, economic stability. Public health outcomes can suffer. Even educational results can be impacted.
So fixing injustice isn't just about making things fair for individuals, it's actually vital for the whole society's health.
Fundamentally, yes, it's about the stability and well-being of the entire collective.
Okay, so we have this problem, this emotional and social damage caused by injustice. What helps? What bridges that gap? The sources really highlighted empathy.
Yes, empathy is crucial. The ability to truly understand and share someone else's feelings.
How does that help with injustice specifically?
Well, when we can genuinely step into someone else's shoes, feel what they're feeling because of unfairness, it often spurs us to act. Compassion kicks in. It can fuel collective efforts for change.
We saw a huge example of that recently, didn't we? The reaction to George Floyd's death.
Exactly. That wave of empathy that swept across the globe, across different groups, it directly fueled the protests, the demands for equity. It showed how powerful shared emotional understanding can be.
A catalyst for action.
Definitely.
And the flip side, what happens when empathy is missing?
Well, the results can be pretty damaging. Think about voter apathy, for example. Some studies suggest that when people lack empathy for marginalized groups, they're less likely to engage in political processes that could actually help those groups.
So if you can't connect with their struggle, you're less likely to support changes.
Pretty much. A failure to acknowledge or relate to the suffering of others allows injustice to just continue, unchallenged.
So empathy isn't just a feeling, it actively shapes what happens in society. It drives action or inaction.
Precisely. It's not passive at all. Fostering empathy seems absolutely necessary if we want a more just world.
Okay, so empathy is key. Now, when people are directly facing that emotional toll, that pain of injustice, another response often comes up: activism.
Yes. When that emotional burden feels unbearable, activism can be a really powerful response. It's partly a coping mechanism, but also, crucially, a way to actually try and change things.
It gives people a sense of agency back, maybe.
Exactly. It's empowering. When you feel helpless, taking action, any action, can make a huge difference to your own state of mind.
And activism looks like a lot of different things, doesn't it? Peaceful protests, for instance.
Right. Protests offer that vital space for emotional support, for solidarity. You see it in movements like Black Lives Matter, people transforming that collective grief and anger into a unified call for justice. There's something cathartic there, knowing you're not alone.
And in our digital world, online activism is huge, too.
Absolutely huge. Social media gives marginalized voices a platform they might not otherwise have. It lets people mobilize support incredibly quickly.
Like the #MeToo movement.
A perfect example. Online activism challenged long-standing stigmas, created a sense of community, a sense of belonging for people who had felt very isolated.
We also shouldn't forget about art, should we? Music, writing, visual art.
Definitely not. Artistic activism is another crucial outlet. It helps people process those really complex emotions tied to injustice. And it offers reflection, both for the creator and the audience.
So activism in all these forms becomes a way to channel that difficult emotional energy into something constructive.
That's a great way to put it. Channeling it into meaningful action for justice and for healing, too.
Taking pain and giving it purpose. Okay, but what about the really long-term view? The sources mention that the effects of injustice can echo through time, even across generations.
Yes, that's the concept of generational trauma. The idea that the emotional wounds of systemic injustice don't just disappear. They can be, in a sense, passed down.
Passed down, how does that work?
Well, communities and families that have experienced profound injustice might see subsequent generations struggle with things like higher baseline anxiety, maybe depression, or just a general feeling of hopelessness, even if they didn't personally live through the original events.
So the trauma's effects linger in the environment, in the family stories, maybe.
Exactly. And people might internalize certain narratives, feelings of worthlessness perhaps, or a deep distrust of authority or society. These things can really hold people back, affect relationships.
And contribute to those mental health issues we talked about, like PTSD.
Yes, potentially higher rates of PTSD and related conditions can persist in communities marked by historical injustice. And sometimes, tragically, unresolved trauma can even shape parenting styles, which then continues the cycle of suffering.
Wow. And this happens on a community level, too, not just within families.
Absolutely. Collective memories of oppression shape cultural identity. They influence community resilience, or lack thereof.
And is that where some social change movements come from, trying to address these historical wounds?
Often, yes. There's a deep need for acknowledgement, for validation of past wrongs.
Mm-hmm.
Healing on that scale really requires things like restorative justice, strong community support systems, ways to finally break those inherited cycles.
Which brings us neatly to those support systems. They sound absolutely essential for healing.
They really are critical. When you're dealing with the emotional distress from injustice, you need mechanisms for healing. Often family is the first line of defense.
A safe space.
Exactly. Someone to express yourself, talk things through without judgment.
And friends, too, I imagine.
Definitely. Friends provide companionship, that crucial emotional validation. Just knowing someone understands and believes you helps fight the isolation that injustice often brings. It builds that sense of belonging.
And what about more formal support?
That's where community organizations come in. They are so important. They can offer things like counseling, specific support groups for people with shared experiences, workshops on building resilience.
Giving people practical tools.
Yes, coping strategies. And things like social justice education or advocacy programs can also help people channel their experiences into positive action, which itself can be healing.
It all comes back to connection, doesn't it?
It really does. Solidarity, that feeling of collective community support. It doesn't just help individuals heal. It's what allows communities to challenge the systemic issues and move forward together.
Okay, so we've looked deep into the problem, the toll it takes, and the importance of support and healing. What about preventing it? What are some broader strategies for building a more just society overall to reduce this emotional burden in the first place?
Yeah, good question. It definitely needs a multi-pronged approach. One major area is policy change.
Like laws and regulations.
Exactly. We need inclusive policies that actively tackle systemic inequalities, things that ensure everyone, especially marginalized groups, has fair access to resources, opportunities.
Yeah.
Revised legislation reforms aimed squarely at social equity.
So top-down changes. But what about from the ground up?
Community initiatives are just as vital. Grassroots efforts creating safe spaces for people to talk, share experiences, and actually work together on solutions.
Collaboration seems key.
Absolutely. Working closely with community leaders, with the people directly affected, is crucial for making sure solutions are relevant and effective.
And education must play a big role, too.
A huge role. Educational programs that deliberately foster empathy and understanding are essential.
How do you do that?
By integrating social justice themes into what kids learn, using teaching methods that get students actively involved, raising awareness about historical injustices as well as current ones. It's about building that sense of shared responsibility early on.
Making it part of how we learn about the world.
Exactly. And finally, encouraging civic engagement is powerful.
Getting involved.
Yeah. Volunteering, participating in local government, holding leaders accountable, empowering individuals to be active agents of change in their own communities.
There's really a combination of things: policy, community action, education, individual engagement.
Precisely. It's the synergy between all these efforts that can really pave the way for a more just society and hopefully lessen that heavy emotional toll we've been discussing.
So pulling this all together, it's clear that injustice leaves a really deep, lasting emotional mark. On us as individuals, yes, but also on the connections between us, the very fabric of society.
That's the core takeaway, I think.
Yeah.
It's not superficial and it's not isolated. Its effects are pervasive and profound.
And the starting point for addressing it seems to be awareness, understanding, and as we discussed, empathy, really seeing the impact it has.
Those are absolutely the crucial first steps. We have to be willing to look and to feel what injustice does to people.
And then ultimately it seems to come down to doing something. That power of collective action, yes, but also just our own individual responsibility to challenge injustice where we see it, to support healing, to work towards that more equitable future.
Yeah.
It definitely makes you think about, what's my part in all this? What role do I play in this ongoing journey?